Undeniably, the world remains plagued by crisis and a host of enduring injustices owed to colonial power and domination.
In turn, countless revolutionary thinkers from times past and present have identified modernity as a point source of oppression.
When taking stock of the violent ways in which modernity was and continues to be forged, the Caribbean has been ground zero. That is the crucible of modernity.
As an intervention that centers the Caribbean, this season of Surviving Society will provide a window into several of the region's grassroots struggles for land, life, and liberation.
On today's episode, we speak with Deanne Bell, a senior lecturer of psychology at Nottingham Trent University. Deanne has conducted research on social emancipation in Jamaica and is currently focusing on the praxis of decolonizing the human in modernity. A guiding question central to Deanne's work is, how can we, as humans, become emancipated from colonial constructions of race and class?
Deanne, we were speaking earlier about your experience, your research, as well as some of the things you've been writing, your personal history, your political convictions, all of which, to some degree, in the Caribbean. And one of the major focuses that we have on this particular season is dissecting or taking an allegorical machete or scalpel to modernity. One of the major questions that we're asking people to address as well as speak to is this notion of modernity. It's a loaded term. It's impossible really completely define and provide the scope of what it means in an hour-long podcast, let alone books and even entire courses. But I'm wondering from your vantage point, what critiques of modernity do you have, as well as into, I think, this key question, what has modernity produced for the Caribbean?
I think for me, the Caribbean is the physical, social, psychological opening of the global relationship that we now call modernity or coloniality. And that, of course, is rooted in our history. 500 years ago, we wouldn't have the configuration of Euro-American capitalism that is definitely linked to modernity, one of the defining features of modernity. We wouldn't have that configuration of Euro-American capitalism and the design of oppression we have today if it weren't for the birthing of modern history in the Antilles. And I say that because if you go back 500 years and you take the European impulse and desire to own the world, and beginning therefore with Spain, and you take the physical pathway, and you're a geographer, the physical pathway Europe decided to go on, sailing west, and then you take what lay on the route from Europe west. And so you're in the Antilles and you encounter the indigenous people who lived there. That was their home, that archipelago. From that encounter, you get the ingredients for what we have today. So you have Europe encountering indigenous people who had their home resources, their way of being. And Europe turns that through then a sequence of events involving displacing African people to the Antilles, to North America, etc. But you have from that encounter anti-Black racism. You have racial capitalism. You have scientific racism. You have denial of truth and denial of this very thing called coloniality. So the Caribbean to me is an epicenter for what we have been living for the past 500 years. So it's not as small as it is physically, it's not inconsequential in world history.
I think that captures the historical as well as significant trajectory of modernity, as well as into the colonial roots that it has.
Yeah.
Your work, I want to pivot to that for a moment, seems to be making a direct intervention into a lot of the different things you were just speaking about. So in terms of looking at racial capitalism and what it's produced in the Caribbean, as well as then too, you've written extensively about indifference, social suffering, as well as even bystanding. And I'm wondering, in the contemporary moment, with respect to the Caribbean, and the things that you're writing about, what is it that we need to know about, or why is it important to consider and foreground things like social suffering, as well as into these notions of bystanding, as well as into the problem of indifference? I'm wondering if you could speak about those things a little bit in relation to your research as well.
For us to understand the social dynamics and the social processes that are between us. And I want to say that when I look and when I did the research you're talking about in Jamaica, and since then, I see indifference traveling throughout the world. Indifference isn't something peculiar to the Caribbean experience. I think it's Robin D.G. Kelly who actually said that indifference is a default. And I hope I haven't ascribed um, something to Robin that he didn't say. But in coloniality, and if he didn't say it, then I dreamt it, and I believe it, that in coloniality, the default attitude is indifference, indifference to the suffering that is produced by the violences that coloniality inflicts. And I'm thinking about the direct physical violences. I'm thinking about all the state violences, all the public violences, all the mass violences. But I'm also thinking about the structural violences. So again, referring back to racism, classism, heteronormativity, ableism, ageism, etc., all of the ideologies that undergird the way that we form social relations. So I think for you to tie together in the question social suffering, bystanding, indifference, I think is right, and I think it speaks to what's happening between us that we are not seeing, but which we are able to see. So it's something that we're making unconscious or unavailable, but it's something that permeates. Where does it come from theoretically, or where did I get the courage to speak about it? I think for sure, Fanon. Black skin, white mass, he's one of the ways I think to read that is to understand that the alienation that Fanon is asking us to consider that occurs to us because of the coloniality of knowledge, right? Because of Western knowledge displacing all other kinds of knowledge, we don't know ourselves through the ways that we would normally know ourselves. We don't have access to that. But we also don't have access to the other. And if we don't know ourselves and we don't know the other, we can't see what's happening between ourselves and the other. I don't know if that makes sense, but that is to me one of the reasons why we see, even in social movements on the left and even in anti-racist movements, that's why we're not seeing what we're doing to each other in these movements.
Mm-hmm.
And that's thwarting, I think, the force of our work. So some people, I think, call it colorism. I don't call it colorism because in Jamaica, for example, I'm produced as a browning, a mixed race person. And of course, in the global north, I'm produced as a black person. And I see them as different class positions because in Jamaica, I have access to the world in a way that puts me in a different class, literally, economically, and therefore socially. So for me, for us to not see this reality is deeply problematic. And I think is part of the reason why we're not actually undoing coloniality faster. It's because we're bystanding these realities. At the tail end of Aimé Césaire's Discourse of Colonialism, the copy that I have, the translated version, the Haitian poet and writer René de Pestre, I don't know if you know René de Pestre's work, but René de Pestre is interviewing Césaire, I believe, could have been in Haiti. Césaire is explaining, I think, what he meant by discourse. Eventually, René de Pestre says, the essence of it is he's saying that there's a relationship between consciousness and reality that we're not yet grappling with. And Aimé Césaire says, yes, absolutely. That's what I think I am also trying to do. It's to contribute to what we know about our consciousness and our lack of consciousness about coloniality, about the coloniality that exists on the outside, but also about the coloniality that has become internalized.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we on the left say, well, we're not racist and we believe everyone is equal, etc., but yet we continue to discriminate against certain people, then this is evidence that really we have coloniality infecting our psychological life and therefore infecting our social relations. And until and unless we actually see this, we're slowing down the work that we say that we are about and our commitments to build an anti-racist, anti-classist world. So that's
Okay.
why I keep on focusing on indifference, because I see it everywhere, and I see it too in spaces that are supposedly about care.
The fraught trappings of mobilizing radical discourse, as well as into maybe the gains and material ends of that isn't necessarily producing what it purports or suggests
Exactly.
that the outcome will be.
Exactly.
You mentioned Fanon. I think on this series, his name will come up frequently, if not in every episode, probably about every 15 minutes or so. You also mentioned, too, the ways in which colonial worldviews, as well as class prejudices, as well as racial animus, these sorts of things. And of course, probably incorporating into that, too, problematic notions of gender and, I mean, even ableism. So you've mentioned a lot of different systems of oppression and domination, as well as then, too, the ways in which, and I love your focus on, of course, the material needs of people and everyone's well-being needs to be secured, but you're also very committed to advancing a project in which people's spirits are uplifted, like the human
Yes.
spirit is rejuvenated and revitalized, which is very Fanonian from my take. And I'm wondering about, in terms of inextricable links between material well-being as well as spiritual well-being, and then this major problem of mass alienation that you've pointed to, as well as into indifference to suffering. What have you identified as some ways in which people can make interventions into mass alienation, as well as go about trying to heal from the open wounds of internalized oppression, as well as even colonial power, these sorts of things?
So, wondering if listeners to the podcast would be familiar with a small book. It's Revolt, She Said. It's an interview with Julia Kristeva. And the interviewer is asking her about the student protests in Paris decades ago. And she's talking about the need for us to experience, to be open to this idea of psychic revolt. And that's really what your question makes me think about. It's that need for us to experience psychic revolt, and it's linked both to the material, transforming the material conditions, and transforming the spiritual conditions, and transforming the social processes through which we relate to each other. I think it's all addressed in that. And if I remember correctly, Kristeva defines psychic revolt as this continuous questioning. But it's not simply the continuous questioning of what's happening out in the social world. It's actually self-interrogation. And Lewis R. Gordon, he could have written this in what Fanon said. I'm not sure where he wrote it, Levi, but he talks about self-assessment. So there are so many thinkers who have helped us to see that any effort to analyze what's happening in the social, physical, material world, but that doesn't mean that or implicate our interiority, is not an effort that's likely to go the full distance. And of course, this critique is not my own. This critique is many, many people's, but a Marxist analysis is brilliant, incredible, but it doesn't implicate the race question. from the get-go. Yeah. So unless we're able to keep what's happening on the outside with what could be happening on the inside of us vis-a-vis racism, vis-a-vis, all of the other ideologies I was talking about, if we isolate one, like classism, like materialism, and we ignore the rest of coloniality, we will never dismantle it. Because, of course, it's a network of these things. So we have to be able to see them, and we have to be able to see how deliberately and continuously they're reproducing themselves on the inside of us.
The negative outcomes and adverse upshots of all the systems of domination that you were speaking about earlier. As well as then, too, it seems like you're alluding to Fanon's famous quote about stretching, a Marxist analysis. Still holds true to this day. It's one of these interesting, if not seemingly kind of disheartening scenarios in which, because I'm a quite ardent as well as avid reader of The Wretched of the Earth. Yeah. And it seems like it continues to resonate to this day, which ultimately to me is a tragedy, because it would be a wonderful scenario if The Wretched of the Earth had become an obsolete book. That might sound like a bit of irony, but had we advanced into a different type of way of ordering society, Fanon's mention of internalized oppression as well as racial exploitation and the lasting consequences of colonialism, what would the world look like if we grappled with those earnestly 50 years ago?
But I would add to Wretched Black Skin White Mass as well, in the same vein that you're speaking of. Because if we took to heart some of the gems that fall out of that text, like this idea of alienation, it's where I think he first speaks about it, or like the idea of sociogeny, the fact that we are, as human beings, we're not nature only, that we are socially produced. If we could see the enormity of these insights, and if we could patiently try to understand what he's pointing to, why he's pointing to that, and then ask the natural question, does this still stand today? Which I think is what you're getting at. If we were asking ourselves these questions, I think we would actually take those initial ideas that, came out of the Caribbean or the Caribbean experience. We'd take these ideas and we'd make them explode. They'd spread.
If only they would catch like wildfire.
Yeah.
In terms of thinking about those ideas spreading or radical potentials in emancipatory praxis exploding, where do you see fertile ground for revolutionary change?
For me, currently, is in curricular decolonization. And I say that because I think I take very seriously, because I see it and I live it, the coloniality of knowledge. That idea that Euro-American knowledge is universalized. And that idea that how Euro-American knowledge is universalized fans out from the westernized university, which is upheld to be the pinnacle of knowledge and ways of knowing. So if we were to actually do the very long, very hard work of decolonizing the westernized university structure itself, then I think we could start to see people being able to turn and looking at a Wretched of the Earth, or turning and looking at a Black Skin White Mass and literally seeing the knowledge that's in there. And of course, not only Fanon's work, but other people's work. So that for me is the forefront of the war against coloniality has to be there, because I don't see how you can reconstruct the social world in political, economic terms without also reconstructing knowledge, because I think all of it is so intertwined and interconnected that the ideas that you need in order to reconstruct political economy and reconstruct everything else are actually rooted and sourced within the university.
My sense is that's perfectly put, because I think you even began one of your most recent articles with a quote from Sylvia Wynter, and I believe she was saying that education was one of empire's most effective weapons. I'm paraphrasing here.
Exactly.
Much like Fanon, political education of the masses is a historical necessity. It sounds like you're making some interventions into that, as well as into when you talk about decolonizing the curriculum. And I work at the University of Liverpool. I used to work back where co-producer Adaeze is at the University of West Indies. That's where I started my career. But I was also produced by universities in the US and then another university in Canada. And when you're talking about the revolutionary possibilities of education, as well as into thinking about your experiences in whatever university, it sounds like you've had quite a trajectory in time of it in different universities and different geographies as well. I'm wondering what types of things are effective with respect to critical consciousness and revolutionary praxis via the education systems and industry that we find ourselves in, as well as into, are there some problematic things or pratfalls with respect to decolonization happening within mainstream education? What is your take on this issue and call for decolonization or decolonizing the curriculum?
So one of the most massive and obvious pitfalls in the decolonization of the curriculum movement is first and foremost that it becomes an on movement, so that it is something that becomes fixed and rigid inside of the university. And the university, when I say the university, I'm not speaking only about NTU or Nottingham-Trent University where I am, or University of Liverpool. I'm thinking about the Western University as a global system. So that's the first thing, that it co-opts the meaning of decoloniality, as if the meaning of decoloniality wasn't something that was produced and created outside of the university, which is where it was produced and created. So, but a second thing related, of course, is what I think of as the EDIification of decolonization. So
Okay.
it's decolonizing curriculum is usually placed under the EDI initiatives inside of higher ed or inside of any institution. And the EDI agenda, which is what it is, it's not a movement. The EDI agenda, as far as I can tell, is a multi-billion-dollar industry globally.
Yeah.
And it's created by people who have power in coloniality. It's not meant to destabilize that power. It's not meant to critique that power. I've been involved in various race equality charter things in the UK, for example, and where it's often used. And of course, the EDI can do nothing about racism because EDI is not prepared to critique what undergirds racism, which, as you and I know, is capitalism. And so, unless you're going to put all of it together and keep all of it together, you're not going to be able to decolonize anything, which is why I think decolonization inside of the westernized university needs to be done by people who are not career decolonialists. I think now of people who are making their name and progressing throughout the university, riding on a decolonial wave as career decolonialists. They don't have a praxis, they don't have a history. What they see is an opportunity. And so they're missing a lot of things. They're low-hanging fruit as to what could be done that they're missing because this is something new to them.
No, I appreciate your candor and think that you have one of the most accurate diagnoses I've heard of what is taking place in this industry, as well as then too by self-interested individuals. And I like that key distinction that you made, that it's sort of the EDIification. That's a great term, similar to the NGOization. I've sort of floated in the development sector, and there's similar domesticating, diluting tendencies and agendas going on there. But the ways in which decolonization, when it's deployed by bourgeois institutions, elite universities that think of themselves as elite, aren't accountable to movements. And it seems to me like you're very much flagging that. And
Absolutely.
what then do the key players and power brokers who are calling for decolonization, what are they accountable to? It seems like maybe their own career, maybe their own citation count, or maybe even the endowment for the university, these sorts of things. So it becomes a bit of a PR exercise rather than a commitment to radical politics. And I'm effectively just summarizing precisely what you've said, maybe in a less cogent way. But in terms of advancing political education, as well as then to thinking about being engaged with movements, I want to pivot a bit and discuss your research a little bit. You've been engaged in and are seemingly a very vocal advocate, which I am also on board with, of participatory action research, as well as into engaging with communities, as well as into ensuring communities that definitely have voices, but voices that have been deliberately silenced are heard. I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about some of your work in participatory action research, as well as some of the community engaged processes and projects you've been a part of. What have those looked like? What have they resulted in? And then two, I think to circle back to something that hopefully you appreciate, what was the degree to which that maybe provided not only yourself, but even participants with the sense of self-efficacy, or that it was spiritually uplifting to engage with those processes? So it's a very long way of saying, can you tell us about some of your work doing participatory action research and what it has yielded?
So I'm thinking about a project I'm currently working on, transforming academic inequalities. And in that, I am looking with others at how the westernized university continues to reproduce this thing that they call the awarding or attainment gap. So they're looking out at what we call colonial difference, which is, these social locations that human beings have been placed in based on colonial categorization, like black, brown, beige, and white. And they're looking out at that. They're not seeing coloniality at all. What they're doing is metrification. So they are looking at the average number of white students who earn a particular degree versus black students. And of course, they've been doing this for a long time. It hasn't moved the needle, and they continue to do this as if it's somehow going to transform this situation and produce equality. And of course, it can't produce equality because they're not prepared to dismantle the structure that is producing this difference in the university. So I created a project in order to bring together people who are interested in speaking about this in decolonial terms. And I did that because the literature that I was reading, it seemed to me that the inquiry was very much framed in the colonial framework, which I was just talking about. And I said, no, let's look at it actually from the perspective of decoloniality. So let's look at it starting off with a critique of the westernized university. And I invited students, and I invited academic colleagues, and I invited people, staff in the universities who aren't academics. It's astounding to me how much knowledge we have about the problem and about how to go about dismantling university structures, and how easy it is to access this knowledge when you ask questions, and people are in a what I call a decolonial atmosphere where people can bring their knowledge not from traditional sources but from any perspective that they have. They can speak from that perspective. So there's a kind of liberatory speech that is fostered in these environments. I think it was Jacques Lacan who marked a distinction between empty speech and full speech. And so for me, in the work that I do, I labor, work hard to try to create conditions where people feel that there isn't a single thing that they would want to say that can't be said in that environment. That's how I think we can actually get at unearthing what is known and knowable and bring it out into the social world. So I haven't finished looking at everything that people have contributed to the Transforming Academic Inequalities project. So I can't yet speak about transformative elements yet, but there's some. I mean, the analysis is there, and I think it comes out of the way that we construct our relationships, the terms and conditions of our relationships. Another project I'm thinking about is the Tivoli Gardens. So a historic atrocity in Jamaica. The government of Jamaica goes into the Tivoli Gardens community in May 2010. This is against the backdrop of the US government wanting a known drug lord who the Tivoli Gardens community call the president. And who is Jamaica to say no to the US government eventually? So the government goes in to try to capture the president. He flees, and at least, by official accounts, at least 75 people, civilians, are murdered. The community says in excess of 250 people were murdered in 4 days. I wasn't living in Jamaica at the time, but the narrative on the media that was circulating was basically the narrative of the colonialists. These people are indispensable. That's the long and short of it. This is what happens. This is collateral damage. And, like everything else, since I have realized that bystanding is actually a form of violence and indifference is a form of violence, I said, this is not how a civil society responds to state murder and state violence. No, there's a role for us to turn and witness. There's a role for us to accompany people who are experiencing collective trauma. And I don't use collective trauma in the usual mainstream psychological perspective of a traumatic event that multiple people have experienced. I mean it in a Kai Erikson, a sociologist sense, who says that collective trauma is actually recognition that bonds are broken, social bonds are broken. So I didn't want to be part of that brokenness. And so I sponsored a project. I invited Deborah Thomas, who's a professor of anthropology at University of Pennsylvania, who had made a film with John Jackson and with Junior Gabu Wedderburn. And so Deborah Thomas, Junior Gabu Wedderburn, and I formed a collective, and we created an oral history project, and we interviewed people from the Tivoli Gardens community, and they asked us to produce a film to tell their story, because they believe that if their story is heard by human rights actors outside of Jamaica, that they stand a chance of getting redress inside of Jamaica. And so we did that, and we produced a multimedia art installation as well. But that project was so guided by the community. I give you an example. Levi, because I'm so adamant that we have to grapple with the ideologies that are between us, I wanted, when we were doing this work, to talk about racism and to talk about classism that exists in Jamaica. I wanted us to turn together and look at this, because I'm in a different social location from people in Tivoli Gardens, and I want that to be part of something that we talk about and talk through. People didn't want to talk about racism and classism. So we didn't. In other words, I'm not going to impose the burning questions I have about the social world I see on a community. That has to be something that we agree we're going to try to talk through and understand more deeply. But if the time isn't right, or if the relationship doesn't allow for it, or whatever, or people don't want to look at that wound, that's to be respected. So, I see participatory action research as being a very powerful way for us to develop critical consciousness, but I also see it has parameters. because of course it's
Yeah.
a methodology that works between human beings. It has limits and edges.
That's a beautiful statement you had mentioned there when you said, I don't know if I know it verbatim, but the project was so guided by the community, as well as into you were talking about relationships, as well as being respectful. And it seems like the project, which also featured a great deal of creative expression, as well as then too were driven by the desires of the communities, generated a variety of different outputs that had impact that aren't necessarily maybe being defined as impactful by a ref adjudication panel, but otherwise would be being defined as impactful based upon community collaboration and consultation, these sorts of things. So we get into this whole politics of defining impact and decolonization, as well as what that means out in the streets or out in the fields versus in the bourgeois institutions. And it's always interesting for me to see the ways in which impact is framed and defined when I meet researchers like yourself, Deanne, who are engaged with community members and saying, I wanted to be respectful, do something that was relevant, and be as responsible as possible. This is what was impactful, and this is what it generated. And then to your point about, even the complexities of wanting to cast a light on some of the pressing issues that are sort of underlying not only Jamaica, but societies in general, class stratification, racial tensions that may or may not be spoken of, but are certainly permeating the air. It makes me think of, I'm working with a comrade in Grenada about the Grenadian Revolution, and I'm quite interested in revolutionary possibilities and social movements, but it's still a deeply sensitive issue to talk about what happened amongst the New Jewel movement in Grenada to this day, because it's a country of 120,000 people roughly. Family members are still alive.
Yeah.
These sorts of things. And so whilst we may, as researchers, think this is what our main objective is with this research front, to cast light on issues of race and class, to discuss critically, as well as really get at the heart of what happened with the New Jewel movement and the way in which it came to an end, these sorts of things. When you engage with community members, perhaps they're basically like, we're not going to talk about those things today because of the potential Pandora's boxes that it might open up. And then how do you end up being respectful about those desires? And it seems like you're very well attuned to that, as well as into being guided by, and I like this, you had also mentioned when you were answering, the terms and preferences of community members, these sorts of things. To go back to your research in Jamaica, as well as in sort of, we began the conversation by talking about modernity, as well as its impact in the Caribbean, as well as into your efforts in trying to advance radical possibilities with respect to decolonizing the curriculum. I'm wondering, and I know the answer to this, but I'm wondering what your thoughts on revolutionary knowledge, or even knowledge from the Caribbean. What merit does it have with respect to political consciousness, as well as then to what role would knowledge from the Caribbean play in, quote unquote, decolonizing the curriculum?
Even before you finished the question, I'm thinking, but look at who we can draw from in curricular decolonization as methodology, not only as content to be taught in. And the names that are on the top of my mind, I just don't see how we could imagine decolonial theory and decolonial praxis without them. Who are we talking about? Frantz Fanon, Amy Césaire, Edouard Glissant,
Yeah.
Susan Césaire, Renée de Pestre, who I was talking about, Sylvia Wynter. These folks are, well, Sylvia Wynter is still alive, Renée de Pestre is still alive, so we can't refer to them as ancestors. But these folks are bedrock thinkers of the ideas that we are now able to think because we had something to read and listen to and engage with that meant we weren't starting from scratch. So when I think about curricular decolonization work, they are the folks who I return to make sure that the newer stuff I'm reading and engaging with isn't so far removed from the original project that the original project is unrecognizable. And you may say, well, hold on a second, because there may be scope for us to, leave the original project because something new has come about. But it's going back to what you and I were talking about early on, that sadly we haven't moved that far. What keeps happening is that, and Mbembe talks about this, I think, in Critique of Black Reason, that there are different iterations. There's maybe even a freshness of the way that coloniality organizes itself. So we definitely constantly have new things to be working on. But the overarching framework of coloniality is still etched in a particular kind of way. And those kinds of ways include what it's doing to knowledge, what it's doing to truth, what it's doing to oppression or freedom, what it's doing to being, what it's doing to power. I mean, those things are perennial since modernity began.
Mm.
Those things haven't changed. Today they may be dressed in a black cloak, tomorrow maybe dressed in pink, but there's still a structure there.
No, it's a very evocative, accurate way to put it. The color and shape may change, but the complexities and oppression remains the same in a variety of different ways. On that note, you had also mentioned earlier, I meant to ask about it when I heard you say it, as well as when I read it in your work, decolonial atmospheres. What is it? I mean, I've read your work and I have a sense of what you're getting at when you're talking about decolonial atmospheres, but I'm wondering about, especially if listeners, when they engage with your work and hear the conversation, if you could elaborate a bit on decolonial atmospheres, as well as then too, what are some practical steps that we can go about to curate or give rise to decolonial atmospheres?
One of the ways that I came to that was through Paulo Freire's critical pedagogy work and insights. And so Freire talks about the need in radical education for adults for us to begin by posing problems, right? To look out at the world, to see reality, to pose problems. And he says that when we're actually engaging in critical pedagogy, the starting point is actually to engage in what people have said about it before. So it's actually to engage in theory. It's actually to engage in the literature. So in the classrooms, when I get to teach from a critical pedagogy perspective, and when I get to teach liberation psychology, critical community psychology, and decolonial theory and praxis, I begin with critical theory from the global South. But Freire says that's not enough, and that in addition to teaching from and teaching through critical pedagogy and theory, we actually need to ensure that what's between us is dialogue. Mm. And I have experienced that as a student in Mary Watkins at Pacifica in her classrooms, and I have experienced it as a teacher. But I saw something else at Antioch College where I taught in the US, and that is that students, when they were able to immerse themselves in this radical theory, to engage in dialogue, that what made the decolonial possible in the room was actually that they could bring every part of themselves to it. So dialogue wasn't cognitive, in other words, Levi. It wasn't only cognitive. Mm-hmm. What was happening is that in the room was affect.
Right.
And so that you cannot force, that you cannot dictate or require. You, as a teacher, you can create the conditions for certain things to happen, but it's co-produce. It's just like a piece of participatory action research.
Mm-hmm.
It's a collective, it's a community thing that has to happen. So it's not something that you can decide to do. It's something that you can commit yourself to facilitating if the conditions are right.
Thank you for that. These things really speak to my heart, because my most meaningful experiences and deepest sense of purpose within academia come from engaging with students, as well as into those instances in which you are part of a participatory research project, which community members may not even be calling it that, that is relevant and useful. And Deanne, you correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like when it comes to this notion of decolonizing within the university, it seems like you're having far more fruitful experiences, maybe with students, than necessarily administrators or even aspiring colleagues with respect to advancing a decolonial possibilities.
That is absolutely true. And I think when I speak with my tribe, meaning folks who do decolonial work in the academy as well, I think that's true for them too. And there are many students who haven't become so alienated from themselves or alienated from the movement for decoloniality that their conviction and their commitment to decoloniality means that they're willing to put themselves on the line. I want to say something about that because that may sound quite confusing. What I mean is, I realize that every day I put my job on the line when I do decolonial work. And that's because I speak truth to power. I see other people in the academy who announce themselves as decolonialists who don't speak truth to power. So they do decolonial research outside of the university.
Mm-hmm.
And they publish pieces on decoloniality that have nothing to do with the structures of the university.
Mm-hmm.
So they're never rubbing against power in their own institution. They're never putting themselves at risk vis-a-vis the institution, if that makes sense. And that's one of the reasons why I think of some people as career decolonialists, because they're not willing to put their money where their mouth is. Collectively, if we were in solidarity and if we were committed to the struggle for decolonizing knowledge, the structure of knowledge, which is a westernized university. And I see this commitment, Levi, as not only something for myself and maybe 2 ages a part of it. I see this as something for generations to come. That if we, in this moment, push against the forces that are trying to ensure that the coloniality of knowledge remains lock solid, if we push against that now, it means that people who are to come have less pushing to do.
Mm-hmm. No, that's very poignant, and it makes complete sense, because my sense is that we're maybe trying to lay the groundwork or create spaces for a better groundwork to be laid or foundation to be laid for future generations to come. Because I don't like to admit it, but I don't know if the utopian world that we would otherwise like to envision and see during our lifetimes, I don't know if that's going to happen.
I don't think it's going to happen in our lifetimes, but I know we can contribute to making it a closer possibility.
Yeah, there's a great, I follow the Zapatistas, and there's a great short story in which there are 2 young Zapatista women, or girls even, thinking about modernity and its destructive advance. And they're talking about getting run roughshod over, or what if this is going to be a brutal, difficult end to kind of what we're trying to advance. And then one of the Zapatista girl named Defensa Zapatistas sharpening a machete and says, well, let's make it count. That sort of thing.
Yeah.
And I love that sentiment.
Yeah.
And it seems like your work, as well as the spirit of it, very much it has those same commitments, as well as then too, like you said, speaking truth to power, or upsetting the apple cart, or rocking the boat within a bourgeois industry ran by middle-class, liberal moderates who want to save face, it can be met with a lot of discipline, as well as into you're making sacrifices if you're trying to kind of do the types of things that you're wanting to accomplish. And some of the punitive repercussions aren't necessarily, well, you've got your walking papers and you're fired, get out today. But it just will mean closed doors and opportunities don't come.
Yes.
And then you
Yes.
won't be considered for certain things, or reviewers
Yes.
on panels aren't amenable because so-and-so, I see their name. These sorts of subtle ways in which discipline is meted out has been shocking to me. I've seen it happen before, as well as then too the ways in which you were talking about, for maybe a lack of a better way of putting it, the professional is the political, where it's effectively if you're committed to decolonization, as small of a way we can do that individually, as well as solidarity, what does that mean about the choices that you're making with respect to your research agenda, who you're engaging with, how you're going about writing about decolonization, these sorts of things. So you're casting a lot of light on a lot of, I think, pervasive and pernicious things that are taking place within academia, as well as then too, it seems to me like on the front lines of a very difficult battle. And it seems like a battle indeed that will also have negative consequences, and there will be a price to pay. But that, of course, is generally the status quo isn't going to let you get away with trying to unsettle things. More ways than one, it seems like you are definitely a credible threat to the status quo, as well as into having to deal with the consequences of that. But then it sounds to me like you are finding some inspiration and hope, as well as upliftment in engaging with students, community members, these sorts of things. And so in talking about that and thinking about the Caribbean, as well as even thinking about decolonizing the curriculum and a lot of the different things that you've been talking about today, reading the world, like Freire would say, as well as then to the importance of not giving up faith or losing hope in the face of seemingly dire consequences. Two of my favorite questions. One is, what does justice demand? So effectively, if you think about modernity and what it has produced for knowledge in the education system, as well as the Caribbean, what would justice look like? Or what would reparation look like for the Caribbean as well as for education? And then the second question, I'll hold off. But it's what would justice demand vis-a-vis what modernity has produced for the Caribbean as well as knowledge?
One of the first primary dimensions of justice for me would be an accounting for the history that we lived and that we continue to live. So it's coming back to this idea of becoming conscious of reality so that we can understand what has shaped us and also what we are continuing to shape and to live. So the historical project is a significant part of a justice project. A very material, physical one, of course, is addressing the inequalities in a financial way that would be absolutely meaningful to human beings' lives. No questions about that. And but there's something else in terms of justice that I think about when I don't lose my mind to coloniality. And that is that we would actually create a lot of justice mechanisms that aren't in our imagination now.
Mm-hmm.
And they would fall outside how to organize political economy. I am not convinced that you can warm up capitalism sufficiently that would allow for every human being in a society to experience a fair take on the society's resources. I'm not convinced of that. And I'm not also saying that communism offers a solution either. So I'm genuinely saying that there's some things that I don't think we have thought of yet that we need to think of if we're talking about radical justice, which I think is what you are asking about.
Yeah.
And there's this psychosocial that I will never lose sight of, not simply because I'm a psychologist, predates that. Justice requires a sense of justice. You have to feel as if you have been justly treated. You have to experience that consciously in order to be able to walk away and say, I live in a just society. So your encounters have to be just. And
Yeah,
that, to me, implicates a psychosocial.
mind, body, and soul, it seems like.
Mind, body, and soul.
Um, and then with respect to kind of creating alternatives, it sounds like we've all have some imaginative work to do as well as in front of us. Very aptly and succinctly put with respect to what justice demands in terms of creating better worlds. My other question, which is related, is about hope. And that's effectively a very simple one. And you can take this in any direction you would like, but where do you find hope? What are your sources of hope with respect to all of the different systems of domination and oppression we've talked about today, but then also two, with respect to recognizing the political agency and acumen of different communities you've engaged with, as well as the different types of resistance and alternatives that people are trying to breathe life into. Where do you find hope amidst all of this?
I know what shifts me into hope and what shifts me out of coloniality, and that is poetry. And when I say poetry, I don't only mean word poetry, but also jazz and conscious reggae music. So when I feel depleted and bereft of hope, I notice, and typically too, when I'm starting to write something, I often feel like this is hopeless. That's one of my initial reactions is what's the point, given what we're up against?
True.
And, and it's so interesting to me that I've developed two go-tos. One is Charlie Parker's, a classic of his, Ornithology. I don't know why that piece of music completely shifts me out of this suffocating, depleting, apathetic colonial attitude into something that feels full of life.
Yeah.
The other is some of, in particular, Bob Marley's lyrics make me know that there's a possibility of something that is beautiful, exquisite, actually. And the fact that he and the Wailers could put radical anti-racist, anti-classist philosophy to rhythms, which were understood and are understood by so many people in the world, and that continue to have currency, makes me feel, and I'm thinking, of the images of people in Tahrir Square in, when was that? 2011.
2011.
Some of the music that was being reached for, at least initially, was Bob. And if you think of Zimbabwe, when Zimbabwe was moving at midnight from being ruled by the British to self-rule, why did they want Bob Marley and the Wailers to be there? There's something about that tone. There's something about the energy of performing. I think of Bob Marley's music as narratives of explanation. They actually help us to understand.
I agree completely.
And hope, you can access hope more easily when you understand what you're dealing with.
Yeah, reading the world, knowing your enemy, maybe the most pithy way to say it.
Yeah.
This might make you as well as listeners roll your eyes, because I'm effectively a very inessential agent in broader struggles for justice and emancipation, but I still will shed a tear if I hear Redemption Song by Bob Marley. And like you were saying, sometimes you can't explain why a particular artist or song or piece of poetry or creative expression moves you, but that one gets me every time. Bring on the revolutionary praxis and bring on the rhythm. And on that note, Deanne, I'm going to thank you for your time, but before we let you go, we've got a bit of a lightning round that we're going to go through. It's a little segment we call Radical Knowledge Beyond the Podcast. What is your favorite quote? Who is it from and why?
So my current favorite quote, because I'm riffing off of it in some work I'm doing, is by Rene de Pestre, the Haitian poet. And he says, and I'm quoting, "They called us blacks, they called us Negroes. They did not consult us. We were never asked. I call this process a disguise, and we were always forced to wear masks. We have entered into life, into modern life, under the cover of masks, under a false identity."
That's very poignant. Question number 2, what social movement should listeners become familiar with and why?
Decolonizing the universe movement, not agenda, movement.
Okay. Key distinction, movement, not agenda. So look to grassroots struggles, look to students, maybe veer away from sort of folks with professional credentials, as well as who may be expecting to call them sir when it comes to this. So look to the movement, decolonizing the university movement. I'm with you on that one. Question number 3, what book is a must read and why?
So I think of late Glissant's Poetics of Relation, because he's offering us an innovative way to rethink relationship between us. It's not the usual social identity politics. It's not framed by coloniality. It's actually framed through what I think he calls creolization. So it's a mashup of, he's a European educated human being who comes out of the Caribbean and who therefore has a different history.
Okay, I'm picking up on a theme of creative expression here. And so we're just going to ride that wave as long as we can.
Ride
it. Into a better future. Number 4, what film is a must-see and why? Besides, of course, the documentary that you produced, what film is a must-see?
I Am Not Your Negro, which was based on James Baldwin's final unpublished piece.
Significant film for listeners to engage with. Number 5, what song or musician is a must-listen and why?
Bob Marley's War and also Guiltiness, those 2 tracks.
What artist, poet, thinker, creative soul should listeners become familiar with and why?
The Jamaican Sylvia Wynter. And that's because her voice, her thinking, her theorization destabilizes coloniality at its foundations. It is unparalleled in how it piles down underneath the foundations of coloniality and does even more drilling.
Down with everything you just said, so listeners can engage with Sylvia Wynter, as well as into, I might add, the work as well as different productions of Deanne Bell as we wrap up this episode. Deanne, I can't thank you enough for carving out time, as well as informing us on a variety of different revolutionary thinkers, musicians, films, books, artists, all of these different things. It's been my pleasure. I found this incredibly inspiring. This has certainly lifted up my spirits. So I'd like to thank you for your time, as well as to extend my appreciation on the behalf of Surviving Society for you sharing your knowledge and insight.
It's a deep honor to be part of this. Thank you very, very, very much.
Thank you for listening to Surviving Society.
To support our work, you can rate,
review and subscribe to host or produce a series of Surviving Society.
Get in touch with us via Twitter or Instagram.